There's been a disturbance in the Force. It's as if 1,000 voices all cried out at once, and then were silenced immediately. They were all asking for more tea.
Can I have some more tea?
I know that was bad. Welcome to Reimagine Entertainment with Josiah Wright, the podcast dedicated to empowering aspiring artists and creatives on their journey to growth and success. I'm your host, Josiah Wright, and I'm thrilled to have you join me today. Okay, so just recently we had Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you, and then Revenge of the 5th. And the Star Wars franchise is a powerhouse in the entertainment industry. Even from the very beginning, when Star Wars first came out back in the 70s, it was a big thing. Nobody had seen anything quite like Star Wars. Groundbreaking effects, a vivid sci-fi world. It was something different and something totally special. But I think that there's a little more to it than that. I think that it comes from a really strong story paired up with some really awesome visuals and some good performances. Now, the franchise is divided into 3 different trilogies. You have the original, you have the prequel, and the sequel. And today I want to kind of break down each one of these trilogies just a little bit, some of my perspectives, and then I want to talk a little bit about some things I might have changed to solidify the foundations of the storytelling in some of these movies. Don't forget to get some more tea. Yummy. Okay. The original trilogy presents a really strong storyline with well-developed characters and a clear hero's journey. Now, the only downside of the original series is the pacing might be a little slow for a modern audience, especially when it comes to some of those lightsaber scenes. But overall, the original trilogy is a classic, and it's widely praised for its storytelling. It starts off with Luke, who is pretty much a nobody, encountering these droids. Now, these droids came from a ship that was under siege and narrowly escaped from the villainous Darth Vader. So right off the bat, we're in the middle of the action. And here's Luke. And Luke is nobody. Luke could be you or I for all intents and purposes. And Luke is presented with this opportunity to become a hero. Obi-Wan asks him to come with him to Alderaan. And Luke says no. Now, a tragedy happened, right? Luke's aunt and uncle died. They were killed by the Empire. And so this was a catalyst for Luke saying, yes, I will go with you, Obi-Wan. And this is super, super good storytelling. Luke picks up allies throughout the original series. We meet Han and Leia in the first movie, and we see Luke being pretty much a nobody, but we get to see some hints at him becoming a hero in that first movie, in A New Hope. We see him beginning to learn about the Force and really becoming strengthened, but he's not quite the hero yet. And we also have some subplots kind of going on with different characters, like with Han, who is a smuggler that just kind of looks out for himself. And he's really challenged with beginning to care about others and put others' needs ahead of his own. And by the end of the movie, Luke destroys the Death Star with Han's help, and we see him become a glimpse of a hero. I mean, he was a hero, but you know what I mean. And then in the second movie, in The Empire Strikes Back, we see Luke and really the whole group of characters going through a lot of conflict and turmoil. And so The Empire Strikes Back is more of a downer. There's a lot of loss. Luke loses his hand. Han gets taken away. We find out that Darth Vader is Luke's father. Spoiler alert. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens in The Empire Strikes Back. And this is kind of the antagonist being able to get a hit in on the protagonist. The villains are able to hit the good guys. And this makes the story interesting. Conflict. And all the while, the characters are changing, right? We see Luke going from being this kid who wants to get off of his planet. And then we see him in The Empire Strikes Back growing in his power, right? He's training with Yoda. We see him growing in his power, and he's still not able to make a difference, and everything is falling apart. But that makes the ending so much sweeter. Because once we get to the third movie, all of the victories are well-deserved, because we've seen the characters experience loss. And then we get this cool plot where we see the redeemed villain subplot kind of eking its way in. Luke is trying to turn Darth Vader, who is his father, over to the good side. And this doesn't work. And Luke is fighting against the dark side inside of him. And so he's continuing to grow and change. But then he ultimately chooses good, and his father ultimately chooses good. And the Empire is defeated, and it's a sweet victory because it's all been built up through the whole trilogy to that point. Now let's talk about the prequel trilogy for a little bit. I like the prequels overall, but I will say the plot gets a little convoluted sometimes. It's a little distracted, and the character development could be better. But I will say that the action scenes and the lightsaber battles, chef's kiss. My inner 12-year-old absolutely loved all of the action. And you better know that I memorized those lightsaber fights. But the overall storyline lacked a little bit of depth when it came to the characters. And sometimes the dialogue was a little cringeworthy. But the prequel series did add complexity to the overall story of Star Wars. It just failed to deliver on the emotional side of things sometimes. This one started off with a couple of Jedi getting caught up in the middle of an invasion. They connect up with the princess who's the leader of this planet and escape the planet with her and her crew. The ship gets damaged. They get stuck on a desert planet called Tatooine, and they meet up with this little boy whose name is Anakin, who is Darth Vader. But kid Darth Vader was actually a slave on this planet, and so through some rigmarole, they're able to free him. They leave the planet because he's like super force sensitive. He's got lots of midichlorians. And Qui-Gon is like, he's the chosen one, and takes him back to see if he can train him how to be a Jedi. And there's a whole bunch of political stuff and some other battles and whatnot. And overall, it was a good movie. And number 2, we have a time jump. Anakin's a lot older at this point, although technically he's not that much older, but because of the actors they chose, it seemed like he got a lot older. But because the Jedi who took Anakin off of the planet died in the first movie, now Obi-Wan is Anakin's master. And so it kind of explores their relationship a little bit. And right off the bat, we see that Anakin is a little impulsive, emotional, and we start to see some character inconsistencies with who he is as Darth Vader. And that can be okay as long as we explain that. And we see Anakin falling in love with Padme, and she doesn't really like him back. And so there's this awkward, like, romance, but not romance. And the dialogue is sometimes kind of meh. And then there's this whole other plot where Obi-Wan is trying to figure out where this clone army is coming from and where it all happened and who ordered the army and blah, blah, blah. It gets kind of convoluted. And then there's a whole political side story as well. There's just a lot going on. And then inside of the third movie, we see Palpatine, who's kind of behind the scenes, kind of pulling the strings, starting to whisper in Anakin's ear and sowing division between him and the Jedi Council even more so. And we see his relationship with Padme, or the princess, kind of developing more. And the war was going on with the Clone Wars and all sorts of stuff happening. And then ultimately, Anakin turns to the dark side, and the movie ends in this battle between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and Anakin is like fatally wounded, but he doesn't die. He becomes Darth Vader, and Palpatine becomes the Emperor. It's this whole thing. But you can see when we look back on that story, it's very windy. It's not a very clear story. There's a lot going on. It gets really confusing. There's just too much going on. All right, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about the sequel trilogy because there's a lot there. But just to name a few things, there was unclear character development, drastic changes to establish characters without proper explanation, unnecessary and boring plot points. The storyline was kind of convoluted at times and confused. In my opinion, it lacked the heart that the previous movies had. But the thing about this trilogy was it had so much potential. It could have been awesome. Now, I will say it was highly visually pleasing. They had a huge budget, but ultimately it didn't make up for the lackluster storyline. So we'll talk about this for just a second, but episode 7 was a little confusing. There was kind of an unclear protagonist whenever I was watching it, and Rey's character was kind of bland and lacked a bit of depth. The mystery surrounding her parents was one of the only things that was kind of keeping her character interesting. But then that was kind of ruined in episode 8. Now, episode 8 was definitely the most creative out of the whole trilogy, because one of my complaints about episode 7 was how derivative it was of the original series. But even though episode 8 was the most creative, it had a lot of problems. I don't care who you are, but when you're dealing with a property with beloved characters, you have to handle things carefully. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean you don't take creative risks. You have to. But if you're going to make dramatic changes to a character like Luke Skywalker, you have to give proper explanation. And I think it required more than just a flashback. The other thing inside of this movie was there was a lot of unnecessary and boring plot points. And the Force powers were too overpowered. And it just kind of seemed like a Deus Ex Machina. Also, Leia being able to use the Force could have been really awesome, but it just came off as weird and poorly executed, in my opinion. And then we get to episode 9, which was confusing, full of fan service, which I don't completely hate, and then tried to retcon issues that were introduced in the previous film. The ending was both good and extremely bad, leaving me and the audience with very mixed feelings. Rey's sudden increase in power was poorly explained, and her character growth throughout the trilogy was not much and not very believable. And I know I'm being a little harsh, but compared to the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy, the sequel trilogy was definitely not the cream of the crop. Okay, so the original trilogy really closely follows something that we call the hero's journey. And I want to talk a little bit about the hero's journey for just a moment. The hero's journey starts with the hero being on an ordinary world. Then they receive a call to adventure, and then they refuse the call. And this can be for lots of different reasons. Then they meet a mentor, and this mentor gives them something that helps them to dispel their fears, helps them to have strength so they can start their quest. And then the hero has to step out of their comfort zone. And then there's this whole thing about tests, allies, and enemies. We see the hero confronted with different challenges that test them in various ways. We see them meet allies and enemies who prepare them for the bigger things that are going to happen later in the story. And then we see them approach the inmost cave. So it's kind of like them searching in themselves, and then after that, leaping into the unknown. And then the hero has to face an ordeal, their most difficult challenge. And only through some form of death can they be reborn. And then there's a reward, right? After defeating the enemy, the hero is ultimately transformed into a stronger person and then receives a prize. And then at the very end, the hero returns home with their reward, but may need one last push back into the ordinary world. Okay, and what we see is the hero's journey loops over and over again in the original series. We see it happen in A New Hope. We see it happen somewhat in Empire Strikes Back. And then we see it happen in Return of the Jedi. And that whole journey also goes across the entire trilogy. And this is a really strong way to tell a story. It's classic, it's proven, and of course, Star Wars makes a little bit of tweaks on when things happen and how they happen, and it doesn't follow this like a checklist exactly, but they did a great job with making this formula work in a really creative way that felt really classic and timeless. Okay, so now the prequel trilogy is supposed to kind of follow the archetype of the tragic hero, and the main components of the tragic hero are they're born of a noble birth. They have some sort of imperfection that makes them human and relatable. They've been wounded by some traumatic experience. They have a fatal flaw, and that fatal flaw kind of leads to them realizing something, and then they meet a significant downfall. Okay, and this is all about tragedy, right? The hero's flaws are tied to what Aristotle believed to be the 3 pillars of tragedy. I'm not going to say all these right. Hamartia, peripeteia, and anagnorousness. And I want to talk about what these mean. Hamartia is the tragic flaw which leads to the hero's downfall. This comes from the Greek word that means to err. It's a flaw that's broken inside of the character themselves. And often it's a blatant flaw. It's a trait, sometimes like hubris or pride or anger. Now, peripeteia is the reversal of circumstances. It's often referred to as the reversal of fortune. And this is a turning point that's brought about by the hero's flaw. This is the consequence of their flaw. And then anagnorisis is the hero's recognition. This is a critical point where the hero has gained insight regarding their true identity or actions, and it forever changes them. So we see this happen in the prequel series. Kind of. It's there. But I think it could have been so much stronger. Here's what I think. I loved episode 1, but I think it would have been a lot better if they would have made Anakin seem a lot older than he was. I think it was a mistake to make him a younger kid. And here's part of the reason why. We only have so much time to connect to characters when we're watching a movie. And when we're watching a trilogy and a character is played by one actor and then it switches to another actor, it's hard for the audience to follow. And so the prequel trilogy would have fared well to have had Hayden Christensen play Anakin the entire time. That way we get more time to like him and care about him as a character, rather than meeting him in episode 2 and seeing him as arrogant, impulsive, emotional, and disrespectful right off the bat. And I think by doing this, it changes things a lot for how we see him as a character, because he's no longer just the cute little boy, Annie. We get to see him as a likable character that's a hero, and we get more time with that face, Hayden Christensen, being able to go over the entire timeline of the story. Also, I think consolidating a lot of the confusing plot lines. Way too much politics. You only need to tell the bare minimum that you need to get stuff across. The original series did this pretty well, actually. I also think the whole plot about the Clone Wars was a lot convoluted, and it would have been better if they would have simplified. And so starting the Clone Wars in episode 1 would have been a great way to just bring it all the way through. And this gives us reasons for why Anakin, even though he's older than most Jedi would be when they start, this gives the Jedi a reason to allow him to come in because there's a war happening and they need help. And what is Anakin's fatal flaw? That's a little bit of a confusing thing to think about. There's a lot to unpack there. It would have been great if they would have made it a little bit simpler. And to me, it's very clear when you look at the character of Darth Vader, his driving force is to protect and bring order. In his mind, that's what he's doing. And so Anakin's fatal flaw is thinking that he's the one that needs to do that. Now, they kind of went into this. This was one of the flaws, but he had so much going on, it would have been better to simplify. And over again, in the prequel trilogy, that is my biggest critique. They should have simplified a lot and told a much simpler story and let the character arcs really add the complexity to the story. And so the reversal of circumstances, once Anakin is heralded as this hero, and they went there in the story, they did, but once he's heralded as a hero, it kind of goes to his head and he thinks he is the hero, and his hubris gets the best of him, and he begins to think of himself as the protector of the Republic, and then the Empire. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the redeemed villain archetype. I think this would have been the best character arc for the sequel trilogy, and I'll tell you why. By the end of the trilogy, we find out that Rey is Emperor Palpatine's daughter, or, well, granddaughter. Since we've already told the hero's journey, and we've already told the tragic hero, how cool would it be to talk about a villain being redeemed? And I think maybe they kind of went there a little bit, but it could have been so much stronger. And my biggest complaint with the entire sequel trilogy was lack of direction. It felt like it was all over the place. At times it felt too derivative. Other times it felt way off in the other direction. It was just a mess. And so by creating a really simple, streamlined story arc for Rey, it could have been awesome. She could have started out as someone living in the desert who was known as the Desert Witch because she'd used her powers to hurt somebody because she got really angry. And this could be out of a lack of control of her powers. She's able to connect to the Force and is immediately drawn into the dark side. And because she's isolated and had some run-ins with people, and she's an orphan and she's had a whole lot happen. She doesn't like people. And how cool would it be if she heard about Luke Skywalker, this hero, this god who knew how to control the Force, stories from the past. And she wanted to find him to learn how to control her power so that she could live quietly. And through a whole bunch of different circumstances, she eventually finds him, and he's able to teach her, and he's able to pull her from her dark tendencies and challenge her to be something more. But she doesn't really respond to that. But then she's faced with a truer face of evil, whether that's in the form of Kylo Ren or Snoke, and somebody that she cares about is really hurt or dies. And then she decides that she doesn't want to be like that anymore and she wants to be something different. And there can still be a whole redemption story with Kylo Ren and so much more, even back all the way to Palpatine if you wanted to have Palpatine be a part of this trilogy. And we see this kind of archetype happen like with Zuko from the Last Airbender, where we see a villain who becomes a hero. And I think this could have been an amazing storyline for the sequel trilogy because it's something that we haven't seen completely yet. We saw it a little bit with Darth Vader turning good at the very end of Return of the Jedi, but how cool would it have been to see a protagonist who was really a villain turned into a hero? Anyways, guys, I just wanted to talk about that for a little bit because we had Star Wars Day, and I love Star Wars. The original trilogy is classic. The prequel trilogy added some extra depth to the world, but sometimes lacked emotional resonance, and there were just some issues that needed to be simplified. And the sequel trilogy had potential, but it missed the mark. But thank you guys so much for joining me today. This has been Reimagine Entertainment with Josiah Wright, and I'll see you next time. Keep creating, guys.